Anyway, I'll get back.
I was always really impressed by you because, like, whenever I was leaving, you're out there on the road running, and I'm just like, I am so fat. Like, I don't do anything. Welcome to the Web of Tomorrow. We're your hosts, Riley Carrasquillo
and Adam Harris.
And today we have our first guest.
Yay! This is Laura Leavitt, and I do know that you were the UX designer of the year at Domo. And you've been working at Domo for
1 year.
Cool.
I just hit my year mark in December, mid-December.
So where did you work before that? Before Domo?
So I worked actually at Johnson & Johnson.
Oh, cool.
Doing packaging design. I worked on Band-Aid primarily.
Oh, really?
I did the kid Band-Aids.
Nuh-uh.
I did the Star Wars collector tins.
Are you serious?
I did.
That is awesome. My wife's a nurse.
Oh,
so,
cool.
like, Band-Aids weirdly are a big part of our life, right? So and I like Star Wars. And
yeah.
So that's super cool.
Oh, the collector's tin project was very cool.
Was that UX or more just graphic design?
I think that's actually it brings up an interesting question, I think, because I think often people consider UX design only digital, like that you're working on a digital product only. And honestly, I mean, and I think this is the first title that I've had at Domo that is actually like UX designer, whereas before I was like, I don't know, what was I? Freelance designer, junior designer, something like that. But Johnson & Johnson is like, you know, they're this huge corporation, and they need to know that like what you're producing, what you're designing is going to sell. So they actually do like all of this qualitative as well as quantitative testing, including eye tracking, like where they'll like list, you know, they'll set up an actual shelf full of all the competitors. You know, they would say SKUs or like packaging, and then the packaging that you designed, and they would make sure that like the eye naturally kind of gravitates to their product first, and offer suggestions. So it is definitely this like tried and true UX experience still. Mm-hmm. The goal in mind is to sell the product, which isn't, you know, it can be, I think in a digital realm, you have a lot more like purposes than just trying to sell, you know. I was talking with Adam earlier about how, you know, you can be a UX designer without ever touching any kind of like, what am I trying to say? Like Adobe software, like Sketch or whatever, right? Like you can just be a researcher. Okay. Like you don't have to build interfaces and still be part of the user experience design process.
Yeah.
So let's take a step back and talk a little bit about how you got into this world.
Sure. So I grew up always thinking that I was going to be an artist. I loved Michelangelo so much when I was in the 6th grade. He was like my hero. When I graduated from high school, I had this art scholarship. I decided to be an art major. And then I quit school for a little bit and took glass blowing classes.
No way, that's awesome.
And then after glass blowing, I took fashion design and pattern making classes. Anyway, all these other things happened, and I was like, maybe I should actually go to real school and have a degree that can do something. And I applied. I love comic books. I'm really into like sequential storytelling. I think it's just very interesting. Cool. And I applied to.
You're like the most like I just need to like I want to pick your brain about so many things now. You just like literally like because I grew up in a family of 4 sisters and a mom, and that's it. So like patterns and stuff. Like my mom loves sewing and things like that. So like you just said that they make comic books and you're just like moving glass blowing like holy cow, like that's incredible. No wonder you won
Jack of all worthless trades. No
those are worthless. It brings my mom a lot of joy.
So I applied to BYU, Brigham Young University, to their art program, and you have to choose, you know, like what your major is going to be. So I applied both to the illustration program and the graphic design program without even really knowing what graphic design was. Like I had a friend who was like, Laura, you know you're going to have to use a computer, right? And I was like, oh yeah, because I was scared. I was like not a computer savvy person. So I got accepted to both, and I had another friend who was like, you should really do the graphic design program. It's a really competitive program. Like, congrats for even getting in. and you can have a job at the end. And I was like, cool, that sounds good. Anyway, the graphic design program at BYU is very intense. It's also very competitive. It's super good. I highly recommend it to people who are up to the challenge. But up until this point, I think they are introducing a little bit more of like UX to their curriculum. Oh. But when I graduated in 2011, I came out with like a very strong emphasis in kind of like traditional design principles and like typography, and very, very print focused, because that's just kind of like the professors there are like very print focused. Mm-hmm. So then I moved to New York and worked, a number of different places. And then I kind of had this shift where I realized, to me, like all of the most compelling and innovative design was taking place digitally. Yeah, I was so used to seeing like all the really beautiful print pieces, and there are definitely still a lot of things in print that get me excited, but I was like, I really would love to help build a product instead of just trying to sell something. A lot of print design, especially now, is so geared just toward marketing. And I was like, what if we could solve other problems? Like, there are all these interesting apps that are like really trying to get people to lose weight, or like help you invest money well, or like, all of these things. And I was like, that is so interesting to solve real problems. So I used all of our money in savings from our savings account and took a UX bootcamp class, and thank goodness cool. It ended up being worth it.
Which one did you take?
There's an organization in New York called General Assembly.
Oh, sweet. I've heard of that.
I took it through. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I didn't feel, honestly, like I learned a lot of new design principles, because I feel like if you are a trained designer, you have been taught to think through a design process. You've been taught to ask the right questions. More than anything, I felt like it taught me a lot about like tech jargon.
Yeah.
And just like the approach and like, what an agile team is. And it helped me get a portfolio piece that was, I created this mobile portfolio piece.
We gear this towards like students and people who are learning and stuff, and so it's cool to hear about boot camps that have worked really well for people.
Yeah, no, I loved my boot camp, and I was so grateful that it ended up, Domo was willing to hire me based off of my portfolio after the boot camp, so I was like, yes. It was scary to use all my savings. It really was. So. And
now, Employee of the Year. I'm sorry I brought that up again, but it was just like a beautiful journey, and we got here. And now we're
seriously, there. To a certain degree, I feel like my boss was willing to like take a chance on me, though.
That's cool.
That I was just like very, very grateful for.
That's
so how big of a part of UX is changing user behavior?
I hope I'm prepared enough to speak to it, because in some ways it's like this total magical thing, right? Like changing behavior is kind of, it's like unlocking the key to the universe if you can change people's behavior.
Yeah. Even changing your own behavior is hard.
Yeah, in some ways it's like I would never claim as a UX designer that I am a psychologist or, something like that. The idea that like a slight shift in hierarchy is going to make something way more visible to somebody so that they draw connections. Obviously at Domo, we're trying to make data become real to people. We're trying to make digestible infographics, and that is really exciting.
Yeah.
Like, it's very cool to have, because I'm not a data person. I do not get what all the data scientists and, I don't know, there's like so many smart people here, but to have them, kind of distill it down to a level where they can describe to me what's happening with the data, what somebody needs to do with this data in terms of use case, and then make that as digestible as I can to a user is like very cool. If they can actually make business decisions off of that, if they have greater visibility to numbers that matter to them, like that's very rewarding. It's very, very cool. It's also often super challenging. Typically, the ways that I will change user behavior are very, very small. This is like you're getting down to design principles like hierarchy and like making sure that you're thinking about it the right way.
So what is hierarchy?
Hierarchy is like color or size or something, some other element, visual element to make something stand out the most prominently, right? But beyond hierarchy, it's understanding the user need of what hierarchy will make sense to them.
I feel like a lot of times designers don't give themselves enough credit, because I would be
Really?
nowhere without a designer, and just because I can implement something, just because you're not implementing it doesn't make it less valuable.
Sure. I still feel like maybe going back to, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, like I guess before we started recording though, in some ways I am comfortable owning this title. I truly am comfortable owning the title of user experience designer, but in some ways I feel like it is a little bit of an audacious title that's been created because a user experience is so related to all the components. Like if the product is not functioning smoothly, like a really well-built product is a huge part of how somebody uses it, right?
So I feel like my title is presumptuous because software engineer, like I'm not an engineer. I saw this article just making fun of the title saying, we're going to rename programming to Googling Stack Overflow.
That's so true.
And instead of giving out computer science degrees, we'll give out Googling Stack Overflow degrees.
All I'm saying is that all the components, like all the people involved, product managers, like they all really influence the experience. And I feel like if there's any mistake that young designers make after going to school, it's that they feel like they're experts, sort of, and not understanding how inclusive it should be of all of those roles, and that a lot of times those people, the other people in the other roles, will have really great ideas, or I don't know, because design theory, I think, it's really important. And I'm not saying sell out, but a lot of times it ends up being very different in practice than like what you learned in school, if that makes sense. I've seen a lot of people who are kind of design purists like not function really well in actual job environments because they feel almost like they're defenders of the faith, or like.
Oh, interesting.
Does that make sense? Is this too obscure for your audience? This is so common for designers. Like, you have to work well with people. I think especially as a UX designer, you really have to be a team player.
No, I think this is good because I don't think we've ever actually included a communication element to this type of work in our podcast.
Yeah.
Here, at least, it's like the make or break of success on the UX team. But I think it makes sense that we're supposed to be, as a UX designer, you're supposed to be empathetic. You're supposed to be like listening to, you're supposed to be aware of what your users need and listening to that, and being willing to iterate and like be malleable with your ideas to match that.
Yeah.
You should also be willing to do that with your own team that you're making the product with, right?
What you're saying is, to understand people, you need to be good at working with people.
Yeah, I am saying that. I'm totally saying that. I really do see that as a huge piece of what I do every day.
So was it challenging when you first started working with developers to speak their language, or vice versa?
It hasn't been for me. I think I've been lucky to work with great developers, but I'm also somebody who, I want to ask. Like, I'm not afraid to ask. I'm like, please explain this to me. Explain the limitations of like why this would be difficult to implement. Even often when I request changes, I'll be like, look, I don't know how this impacts your timeline. I don't know I don't know if this is a small change for you or if this is a big change for you. Please let me know, because if it's a huge change and it's going to impact timeline, then we'll try to come up with a compromise.
And so how much the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript do you need to know?
My advice, honestly, I mean, this has worked out for me, though, is to not run out and try to be like a jack of all trades. I think it is awesome if you know that. Like, if JavaScript is your thing and you really want to learn it, that is awesome. It's never going to hurt you. As a designer. For me, I'm not interested in working in an organization that is trying to just find, like to me, a job description. I don't know, maybe this isn't true though, because I just saw a job description recently with, Bloomberg. That was, it was a designer position where they were like, please write code. And I was like, whoa, Bloomberg. For me, I'm less interested at working in an organization who wants me to be like a total jack of all trades.
Yeah.
Because to me, that's showing that the design process maybe kind of like merges with the development process. I am doubtful that it creates the best user experience.
We talked about a little bit about how design can change user behavior. Mm-hmm. And how do you know if you're asking too much to the user? Is there anything you can do there?
I guess it depends on what context you're...
I feel like users can be stubborn, right? They don't like change.
Users can definitely be stubborn. I mean, one thing that the way you're phrasing it, maybe this is hopefully it's not too specific of an answer, but it's really important, as much as you want to be up on the latest web trends and stuff of like what's happening in user interface design, you really want to stick to familiar conventions.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, it's so important. If you're trying to like reinvent the drop down and get users to change that way, where you're like, oh my gosh, I have this amazing design idea, I'm totally going to reinvent the internet.
It's going to be like a scroll wheel and...
yeah, totally. It's going to be... It's going to be probably crazy, and I mean, all the time, even when I was, in school studying print, my professor would say all the time, don't reinvent the wheel. Seriously, don't reinvent the wheel. Copy something that is so simple and beautiful that you love.
That makes me interested about, how, like, the settings gear is kind of being replaced by the hamburger.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How does that happen? How does that develop? I wonder. Sorry, that's just a random question, but like...
Yeah, how do conventions...
Because I
totally agree with you with that. But like, there's got to be someone, a job,
I do think that the hamburger icon originated from mobile design, because...
Oh, that's true.
Yeah, I mean, because it's representing that stacked... that
right.
narrow stacked menu.
And then the pull to refresh is another example from mobile. It has become a convention.
Right.
So you don't want the refresh. I guess the idea is you don't want the refresh to take up space, but you still want them to feel like they can refresh.
Yeah, definitely. Thank goodness for mobile conventions.
Yeah.
I feel like when web pages were like, that everything had to be above the fold, whatever the fold is, because it's always changing based on what monitor you're using.
There is no fold.
There is no fold. Thank you. There is no fold, but I feel like mobile brought that forward, and I'm like, yes! I had somebody in a meeting last week, though, be like, we're worried about the fold. And I was like, no! There is no fold.
This is something that I'm really interested in as we try to gear this towards people who might be interested into getting to UX. What are some resources that they can go to dip their toes in before they make a big jump, like boot camp or college, or how can they get into it before making that decision?
Sure. I think maybe the most important thing is trying to think of a digital problem. I had an idea for an app that I was very excited about, and I was like, I should try to sketch this out. I should try to work through the reality of putting this together. If you have any kind of interest in that, start, and you'll kind of understand how difficult it is to arrange your thoughts and make sure that your flow is cohesive.
Yeah.
It's much more difficult when you're doing it than what you think. Because apps, beautiful interfaces, beautiful user experiences are really simple and really intuitive, and I think that can make it sometimes seem easy, when in fact there's all this work that's gone into it and a lot of smart thinking involved. I read first this book by Steve Krug, Krug, I don't know how you say his last name. Don't Make Me Think, which I think is I think it's a really great book. I mean, there's this example of how Amazon got huge that I always think of from that book.
I think that's a great book for designers and developers.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think it's so good. He talks about how Amazon's success is basically due to just having a single search field. Because Barnes & Noble, who was also selling books, had this whole you had to filter for what book it was, genre,
or author.
It was more like
title.
A library. It's how you search for a library book now. And Amazon was just let's have one search field, and that was pretty much what made Amazon, which is so cool to have that kind of really simple UX innovation that has change the world and the internet, you know? I would also encourage people to not just think about UX design as being like the internet or an app. I think there are so many places to draw inspiration from, even in the sense of like something I wanted to touch on, because we talk about so much research going into product design. Think about storytelling. To me, that's something I pull from my more traditional graphic design background, because you're always talking about storytelling in the sense that, like, you know, we were learning how to repackage a product. And I remember someone in my class was doing milk, which is kind of a challenging project. Yeah. But, you know, she ended up going with this very cool kind of abstracted graphic of grass. And the story that it tells is that cows eat grass. And then milk comes from the cow. And so, you know, it kind of removes all of this reality of, like, the industrialized process of milk as we know it. But I think that there are so many ways, instead of just completely copying, like, the look and feel or brand of some website you think is cool. I don't like really think about the story that you're telling. Does that make sense?
No, totally.
Yeah.
There's a lot of...
Does that go along with, like, creating personas and thinking, oh, what is this user?
Totally.
They're
It's like
going throughout their day, and what are they going to do in this situation?
Yeah.
Yes. What story appeals to this user? What, I don't know. There are so many... Anyway, I have, like, examples of, I think, apps that tell good stories, even though they're, like, very utilitarian. But I think it's something that sometimes gets lost in digital design and web design just a little bit, because people are just like, we have this startup idea, let's just throw a logo that kind of looks cute and techy. And I'm like, no, there are awesome design and storytelling principles that you can pull into this to make it so much better.
Awesome.
Anyway.
Yeah, thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah, you are so welcome. Thanks for having me.
So rate, subscribe, and we hope you enjoyed this. We love to hear any comments that you may have or questions that you may have, and we love to answer them.